Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been a ranger at Cascade Ridge National Park for 6 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these woods had to offer. Bear encounters, lost hikers stumbling out after 3 days with nothing but creek water in their bellies, even a small plane crash back in '19 that left debris scattered across the northern ridge like confetti from hell. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I found on the midnight patrol route that October. After Labor Day, the park doesn't get many visitors. Until mid-October, it's just me, Dalton, the maintenance worker who lives at the facility year-round, and Reyes, who occasionally comes up from the valley to check the water systems. Most nights I'm alone in the ranger station, watching the security cameras flicker between empty trailheads and dark parking lots, listening to the wind sighing through the pine trees like something breathing. That particular night started normal enough. I clocked in at 2200 hours, made my coffee, black, always black, the way my father taught me back when I was barely tall enough to reach the pot, and settled into the routine. The first patrol sweep wouldn't happen until midnight, which gave me a couple of hours to catch up on paperwork and monitor the radio chatter from the valley station. Dalton had mentioned earlier that day he'd be working on the generator at the north compound, so I wasn't expecting much company. Around 23:30, I grabbed my flashlight, keys, and radio, then headed out to the truck. The air had that particular October bite to it, the kind that makes your lungs ache on the first breath. I could see my exhale hanging in the beam of my flashlight like frozen ghosts. The stars were out, bright and cold, and there wasn't a cloud anywhere in the sky. It should have been a beautiful night. Should have been. The midnight patrol route covers about 15 miles of fire roads and trailheads, checking for any vehicles that might have ignored the sunset closure, looking for illegal campers, that sort of thing. I'd driven it maybe 200 times over the years, knew every pothole and washout by heart. But when I pulled up to the Whispering Pine trailhead around 1:15 midnight, something felt off. The parking lot was empty, as expected. No tire tracks in the dust, no footprints near the information kiosk. But there, right at the mouth of the trail where the dirt path disappeared into the tree line, I saw it. A single boot print, pressed deep into the soft earth. Just one. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, studying it through the windshield. It was fresh. I could tell by the sharp edges of the tread pattern, the way the displaced soil hadn't settled yet. I grabbed my mag light and stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots loud enough to make me wince. The forest at night has its own kind of silence, the kind that isn't really silence at all, but 1,000 small sounds layered so thick they become white noise. Usually, I found it comforting. That night, it felt like the woods were holding their breath. I walked over to the boot print and crouched down, running the flashlight beam across it. Size 11, maybe 12. Deep ridges consistent with a hiking boot. Probably Merrill or Vask. The print pointed toward the trail, like someone had been standing there facing the darkness. What bothered me was the lack of a second print. No approach, no departure. Just this one perfect impression in the dirt, like someone had materialized right there at the trailhead and then vanished. I keyed my radio. "Station, this is Briggs at Whispering Pine. You copy?" Static answered. Then Dalton's voice crackled through, distant and tinny. Copy, Briggs. What's up? Got something weird here. Single boot print at the trailhead, no other tracks. You log any vehicles through here today? A pause, more static. Negative. Haven't seen anyone pass the south gate since Tuesday. Weather station guys, I think. Roger that. I'm going to walk the trail a bit, see if I can find anything else. Keep the channel open. Copy. Be careful out there. I clicked the radio back onto my belt and swept my flashlight across the trailhead again. Nothing. Just that one print sitting there like a question mark. I stepped past it carefully, not wanting to disturb potential evidence, and started up the trail. Whispering Pine Trail is a moderate 3-mile loop that winds through old-growth forest before circling back to the parking lot. During the day, it's one of the prettier hikes in the park, dappled sunlight through the canopy, a small creek that runs alongside the path for the first mile, decent elevation gain without being punishing. At night, with nothing but a flashlight beam cutting through the dark, it's a different animal entirely. I'd walked maybe 50 yards when I realized I wasn't hearing anything anymore. The usual night sounds, wind in the branches, distant owl calls, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, had stopped. Completely. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. I paused, listening, my breath loud in my own ears. Nothing. Not even the creek, which should have been audible from here. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the trail ahead. Another boot print, same size, same tread pattern. But this one was different. It was offset, angled wrong, like the person had been walking sideways or backward. I moved closer, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw the third print. Then the fourth. They weren't following the trail anymore. The prints veered off into the forest, into an area so dense with undergrowth that nobody in their right mind would try to push through, especially at night. But there they were, a scattered trail of boot prints leading into the darkness between the trees, each one deeper than the last, like whatever made them was getting heavier with every step. I should have called it in. That's protocol. Anything unusual, you report it. You wait for backup if necessary. You don't go wandering off into the woods alone at midnight chasing phantom footprints. But something pulled me forward. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the 6 years of ranger training telling me that someone might be hurt or lost out there. Or maybe it was something else, something I don't like to think about too much. I pushed into the undergrowth, branches catching at my jacket, brambles scraping against my pants. The boot prints continued, impossibly deep now, like they'd been made by someone carrying an enormous weight. My flashlight beam jerked and swayed as I moved, catching fragments of the forest in harsh white light. The pale bark of birch trees, the dark mass of pine needles, the glint of spider silk stretched between branches. After about 20 yards, the print stopped. Just ended. The last one was so deep it looked like it had been stamped into the earth by a hydraulic press, the edges of the boot tread cut so sharp you could count every ridge and valley. And beyond it, nothing. No disturbed leaves, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had continued in any direction. I stood there, breathing hard, my heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest. The silence was total now, oppressive, like the weight of the entire forest pressing down on me. I turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight in a circle, and that's when I saw it. About 30 feet away, barely visible through the trees, something was standing, or something that looked like it was standing. The shape was wrong, too tall, too narrow, and it didn't move the way a person should move. It was absolutely still, but somehow gave the impression of motion, like heat shimmer on asphalt or the surface of water just before rain. My light couldn't quite focus on it. Every time I thought I had it pinned, it seemed to shift slightly, staying just at the edge of clarity. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, maybe. Could have been minutes. Time felt elastic, unreliable. The shape didn't approach, didn't retreat. It just existed there in the space between trees, watching me with whatever it used for eyes. And I knew, with a certainty that lived in my bones, in some ancient part of my brain that remembered when humans were prey, that it was aware of me. My radio crackled to life, making me jump so hard I nearly dropped the flashlight. Dalton's voice, scratched and distorted, barely recognizable. "Briggs, you..." "Copy." I grabbed for the radio, not taking my eyes off the shape. "Dalton, I'm here. Say again. Interference. Reading. Strange. Your position." The static swelled, became a roar of white noise, and underneath, barely audible, I heard something that might have been breathing. Or wind, or neither. When I looked back at the space between the trees, the shape was gone. I got out of there fast, crashing back through the undergrowth with none of the care I'd used going in. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, and the whole time I had the crawling sensation of something following just behind, just out of sight, matching my pace exactly. I didn't look back. Some instinct older than thought told me that looking back would be a very bad idea. I broke out onto the trail, gasping, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The radio was still hissing static, louder now, punctuated by bursts of what sounded like words in a language I didn't recognize. I turned it off, suddenly terrified of what I might hear if I kept listening. The walk back to the trailhead felt like it took hours. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made me flinch. And the silence, that horrible pressing silence, followed me the whole way. When I finally stumbled into the parking lot, my truck sitting exactly where I'd left it under the sodium lights, I felt a relief so intense it made my knees weak. I sat in the cab for a long time before I could make myself start the engine, just breathing, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Fatigue, maybe, or the early stages of hypothermia playing tricks on my perception. The mind does strange things when it's stressed and cold and running on too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But when I pulled away from the Whispering Pine trailhead, I checked the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood freeze. There, right at the mouth of the trail, illuminated by my taillights, a fresh boot print, pointing away from the forest, toward the parking lot, toward where my truck had been parked. I reported it all the next morning, leaving out the parts that sounded insane. The shape between the trees, the feeling of being followed, the breathing under the radio static. I focused on the facts: unexplained boot prints, possible trespasser, request for daylight search. Reyes and another ranger went out there around 0900 with a tracking dog, walked the entire trail twice, checked the surrounding forest. They found nothing. No boot prints, not even the ones I'd photographed with my phone, though those photos came out strangely blurred, like I'd been moving when I took them, even though I definitely hadn't been. The official report listed it as animal tracks that I'd misidentified in poor lighting. I didn't argue. What was I going to say? That I'd seen something impossible in the woods? Something that defied the basic rules of how things are supposed to work? I tried to put it behind me. Went back to my regular patrols, told myself it was nothing. Just one weird night in 6 years of weird nights. The park has a way of playing with your head when you spend too much time alone in it. Everyone who's worked here long enough has a story about seeing or hearing something they couldn't explain. It's part of the job, part of the territory. But 3 nights later, I was back on midnight patrol, and when I drove past the Whispering Pine trailhead, I saw it again. A single boot print, fresh and deep, right at the mouth of the trail, pointing into the darkness. I didn't stop. I kept driving, hands clenched on the wheel, eyes straight ahead, telling myself I wasn't going to look in the rearview mirror this time. But I did look. I couldn't help it. And there, backlit by my taillights standing right where the print had been, was that shape. Tall and narrow and wrong, absolutely motionless, watching me drive away. It happened again a week later, then 4 days after that, then twice in 1 week. Always the same. The single boot print at the trailhead, pointing into the forest. And if I checked my mirrors as I drove away, and God help me, I always did, there it would be. Standing, watching, never moving, never approaching, just there. I started varying my patrol route, avoiding Whispering Pine entirely some nights. But it didn't matter. I'd find the boot print somewhere else. At the Pine Creek parking area at the overlook on Ridge Road, once even right outside the ranger station door. Always one print, always pointing the wrong direction. Always too deep, too perfect, too deliberate. Other rangers started noticing changes in me. I wasn't sleeping well. Coffee couldn't touch the exhaustion that settled into my bones. I jumped at sounds that shouldn't have startled me. Reyes asked if everything was okay at home, suggested maybe I should take some personal time. Dalton stopped making jokes when I was around, started watching me with this concerned expression that somehow made everything worse. I couldn't tell them. How do you explain something like this? There's no vocabulary for it, no frame of reference that doesn't make you sound like you're having a breakdown. So I kept quiet and tried to function and told myself that eventually it would stop. Whatever it was, it would just stop and things would go back to normal. That was before the night I found the second set of prints. It was late November by then, first real snow of the season dusting the high elevations. I was finishing up a patrol around 0200, bone-tired and thinking about the bottle of whiskey waiting in my locker back at the station, when I saw them. 2 sets of boot prints this time, both leading to the trailhead at Old Mill Road. Both the same size, same tread pattern, but one set was pointing into the forest and one set was pointing out. I sat in the truck with the engine running, watching those prints in my headlights, trying to make sense of it. It looked like someone had walked into the forest and then walked back out. Normal. Explainable. Except I knew. The same way you know when someone's watching you, the same way you know when you're not alone in a room, that whatever made those prints hadn't walked back out. Something wearing its shape had. My radio hissed to life, making me flinch. No voice this time, just static. But underneath the static, so faint I might have imagined it, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps like someone walking on gravel. Getting closer. I looked up at the trailhead, and my breath caught in my throat. There were 3 shapes now, standing just inside the tree line. Tall and narrow and absolutely still, arranged in a rough triangle, their not-quite-right forms barely visible in the spill of my headlights. And as I watched, a 4th shape emerged from the darkness behind them. Then a 5th. They weren't moving toward me. They didn't need to. The message was clear. Whatever this was, it was spreading, growing. And I was the only one who could see it. I put the truck in reverse and got out of there, the radio howling static the entire way back to the station. When I pulled into the compound, I saw Dalton's light on in the maintenance shed, and for a moment I considered telling him everything. But I knew how it would sound. Knew he'd look at me the way Reyes had been looking at me, like I was fragile, like I was breaking. I went home instead, to my little cabin on the south boundary of the park, and I sat at my kitchen table with that bottle of whiskey until the sun came up. I didn't drink it, just held it, feeling its weight, thinking about my father and the stories he used to tell about the woods where he grew up in northern Maine. Stories about things that lived between the trees, things that were there before people and would be there after. Things that didn't like being disturbed. You see something in the woods that doesn't make sense, he'd told me once, when I was maybe 8 or 9. You don't try to make sense of it. You tip your hat, say excuse me, and you walk the other way. I'd laughed at him then. Thought he was just trying to scare me, the way fathers do. But sitting in my kitchen that morning, watching the weak November sun struggle through the clouds, I understood. Some things don't want to be understood. Some things exist in the spaces between understanding, and trying to drag them into the light just makes them angry. I called in sick for the first time in 6 years. Stayed home, kept the doors locked, tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. But when darkness fell and I heard something walking around the perimeter of my cabin, slow, heavy steps that were definitely too heavy for a deer or a bear, I knew I wasn't being ridiculous at all. The footsteps circled the cabin 3 times, always staying just outside the reach of the porch light. I sat in my living room with all the lights off, barely breathing, tracking the sound as it moved. It never tried the doors, never approached the windows. Just walked that circuit around and around, like it was measuring something, or marking territory. Around 0300, the footsteps stopped. I waited in the darkness for another hour before I risked turning on a light. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I saw what I knew I would see. A trail of boot prints in the snow, circling my cabin in a perfect loop. They started and ended at the same point, right in front of my porch steps. A complete circle, with no way in and no way out. I didn't go back to work for a week. When I finally did return, I put in my notice. Told them I'd been offered a job in Colorado, better pay, needed a change. They were sorry to see me go, but understood. Rangers don't stick around here forever. The park has a way of using people up, spitting them out when it's done with them. Dalton threw me a going-away party at the ranger station. Reyes brought a cake. A couple of the seasonal workers showed up with beer. It was nice, in a melancholy sort of way. I made all the right noises about staying in touch, about coming back to visit. Everybody knew I wouldn't. On my last night, I did one final patrol. Saved Whispering Pine for last, because I knew I needed to see it one more time. Needed to know if it was still there, still watching, still waiting. The boot print was there, same as always. But this time I got out of the truck, walked right up to it, stood there, looking down at that impossible print in the dirt. The forest was silent, holding its breath, and I knew without looking that the shape was there too, somewhere in the darkness between the trees. "I'm leaving," I said out loud, my voice strange and small in all that silence. "I'm going away. You can have this place, I won't bother you anymore." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, so faint I almost missed it, I heard something that might have been wind moving through the branches. Or it might have been something else, something that sounded almost like a voice, saying words I didn't understand in a language that predated words. When I got back in my truck and looked in the rearview mirror, the shape was there. But it was different somehow. Smaller maybe, or less solid. Like it was already fading back into whatever place it had come from. I drove away slowly, watching it recede in the mirror until it was just a smudge of darkness against darker trees. And then it was gone. That was 17 years ago. I work in Colorado now, like I said I would, in a park where the mountains are cleaner and the forests feel younger, less heavy with whatever wait time and growth and countless silent years can bring. I'm good at my job. I train new rangers, lead search and rescue operations, do everything a senior ranger is supposed to do. But I've never worked another midnight patrol. Always find a reason why someone else should take it. Always trade shifts. Always make myself unavailable. Some of the younger rangers probably think I'm getting soft, losing my edge. That's fine. Let them think that. Because here's the thing they don't tell you in ranger training. The thing you only learn after you've spent enough time in the deep woods, in the old places where the trees remember things we've forgotten. There are parts of the forest that don't belong to us. Places that tolerated our presence for a while. that let us walk our trails and mark our boundaries and pretend we were in charge. But tolerance isn't ownership. And sometimes, if you push too far, or stay too long, or pay too much attention to things that prefer not to be noticed, that tolerance runs out. I still see boot prints sometimes, here in Colorado. Never at trailheads, never forming trails. Just single prints in impossible places, on a boulder that would require climbing gear to reach, in a patch of mud on the far side of an uncrossable river, once on the roof of a patrol cabin that I knew had been empty all season. I don't investigate anymore. I log them in my reports as animal tracks, soil displacement, weather phenomena, anything but what they actually are. And I try not to think about Cascade Ridge, about Whispering Pine Trail, about the shape that stands in the spaces between trees. Try not to wonder what it's doing now, whether it's still there, whether it remembers me the way I remember it. But late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment in Boulder and the wind is moving through the trees outside my window, I sometimes hear my radio crackle with static even though it's turned off and locked in my truck. And underneath that static, faint and far away, I hear footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, like something walking on gravel, getting closer. Last month, I got a message from Dalton. First time I'd heard from anyone at Cascade Ridge in years. He said they'd hired a new ranger to replace someone who'd quit unexpectedly. Couldn't handle the isolation, apparently. This new guy was young, eager, wanted to make a name for himself. He'd been asking Dalton about the history of the park, about any unusual incidents, about stories the old-timers used to tell. Dalton wanted to know if I remembered anything worth sharing. Any advice for a rookie who was maybe a little too curious for his own good? I haven't responded yet. What would I say? Don't work the midnight patrols. Don't investigate the boot prints? Don't look into the spaces between trees, and if you do see something standing there, something that doesn't move right and doesn't look right and makes your hindbrain scream at you to run, don't try to understand it. Don't try to document it. Don't try to make it make sense. He wouldn't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me back when I was his age, back when I thought I understood how the world worked. So, I'll probably just tell him what my father told me. If you see something in the woods that doesn't make sense, you tip your hat, say, "Excuse me," and you walk the other way. He'll laugh it off, same as I did. And maybe he'll be lucky. Maybe whatever lives at Whispering Pine will leave him alone, will have gotten bored with the game, will have moved on to some other quiet corner of some other forest. Or maybe, sometime soon, Dalton will call me again. This time, his voice will be tight with worry, asking if I've heard from the new ranger, if I know why he's been calling in sick, why he looks so tired all the time, why he flinches at shadows and can't seem to finish a midnight patrol without coming back pale and shaking. And when that call comes, because I think it will come eventually, I'll have to decide whether to tell the truth or to keep quiet. Whether to warn them about what's waiting in those woods, or to let them figure it out on their own the way I had to. Part of me hopes I won't have to make that choice. Part of me hopes the new ranger will be smarter than I was, will recognize the warning signs and get out before it's too late. But the rest of me, the part that spent 6 years at Cascade Ridge, the part that knows those woods and the things that move through them, knows better. Because the boot prints are still there. I know they are, still appearing at trailheads, still pointing in impossible directions, still too deep and too perfect and too deliberate to be anything natural. And somewhere in the darkness between the trees, patient and still and absolutely aware, something is standing. Watching, waiting. It waited for me for 6 years. I think it can wait a lot longer than that. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I pull up satellite images of Cascade Ridge on my computer. I zoom in on the familiar contours of the park, trace the fire roads I used to patrol, locate the small parking lot at Whispering Pine Trailhead. The images are always a few years old, taken during daylight hours when the forest looks innocent and ordinary, when you can't see the shadows between the trees or the shapes that might be standing there. But if I zoom in far enough, if I look at just the right angle, I can sometimes see something that makes my breath catch. A dark spot on the trail, roughly the size of a boot print. Just one, always just one, pointing into the forest. And I wonder if it's really there, or if I'm just seeing what I expect to see, what I'm afraid to see. I wonder if the satellite captured something real, or if my mind is playing tricks, finding patterns in random pixels the way people find faces in clouds. I wonder, but I don't try to find out. Because some questions are better left unasked. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. And some parts of the forest, the old parts, the deep parts, the parts that were there before we named them and will be there long after we're gone, are better left alone. I close the laptop, turn off the lights, and lie in the darkness listening to the wind move through the trees outside my window. And I try very hard not to think about boot prints, or midnight patrols, or the sound of footsteps that might just be wind. But I always listen. I can't help it. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, in that ancient place that remembers when humans were prey, I'm still waiting for the sound of gravel crunching under deliberate, impossible feet. Still waiting for my radio to crackle to life with static and breathing. Still waiting for that shape to appear at the edge of my vision, tall and narrow and wrong, standing in the space between what is and what can't possibly be. 17 years, and I'm still waiting. And here's what scares me most. I don't think I'll have to wait much longer, because 3 days ago, I found a boot print outside my apartment building. Just one, pressed deep into the soil of the planter box by the entrance. Same size, same tread pattern, same impossible depth, pointing at my door. I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? I've spent 17 years running from something that shouldn't exist, something I saw in a forest 1,000 miles away, and now it's found me? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I've been crazy since that first night at Whispering Pine, and everything that's happened since has just been my mind eating itself from the inside out. But the boot print is still there. I check every morning, and it's still there. Slowly filling with rainwater and fallen leaves, but never quite disappearing, never quite fading away. And last night, around 0300, I heard footsteps outside my apartment. Slow, heavy steps moving back and forth across the parking lot like something pacing, like something trying to decide whether to come closer. I sat in my living room with all the lights off, the way I did in my cabin 17 years ago, and I listened. The footsteps went on for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I saw what I knew I would see. Boot prints in the parking lot, forming a rough circle around the building entrance. They started and ended at the same point. A complete loop, with no way in and no way out. I'm writing this down because I think someone should know. If something happens to me, if I disappear, or if I'm found, but I'm not quite right anymore, not quite myself, someone should understand that it wasn't random. It wasn't an accident or a coincidence or a mental breakdown, even though that's what everyone will think. It was the forest, the old forest, the deep forest, the part that we mapped and named and pretended to own but never really understood. It was the thing that lives in the spaces between trees, the thing that's patient and still and absolutely, terribly aware. The thing that I disturbed 17 years ago when I followed those boot prints into the darkness, when I looked at what I shouldn't have looked at, when I tried to understand what was never meant to be understood. I'm going back to Cascade Ridge tomorrow. Driving through the night, should be there by dawn. I've told my supervisor I need to take some personal time, maybe a week or two. He was concerned. I never take time off, but he didn't push it. I don't know what I'm going to find when I get there. Don't know if the boot prints will still be at Whispering Pine, or if the shape will still be standing in the shadows, or if any of it was ever real in the first place. But I need to know. After 17 years of running, of trying to pretend it never happened, of checking over my shoulder and starting at shadows, I need to know. Maybe I'll find answers. Maybe I'll find nothing at all. Or maybe I'll find something worse than either of those options. Something that I can't run from anymore because it's been waiting for me all this time, patient and still, knowing I would eventually come back. My father used to say that some debts can't be outrun. You can try, you can put miles and years between yourself and what you owe, but eventually it catches up. Eventually, you have to pay. I think I've been in debt for 17 years. I think I borrowed time I shouldn't have borrowed, saw things I shouldn't have seen, walked away from something that doesn't let people walk away. And now the bill is due. If you're reading this, if I never came back from Cascade Ridge or if I came back wrong somehow, tell the new ranger at Whispering Pine to be careful. Tell him not to investigate the boot prints, not to follow them into the forest, not to look into the spaces between trees where shapes stand that don't quite move right. Tell him some mysteries are better left unsolved. Tell him to walk the other way. Tell him, God, there's someone at my door. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow and deliberate, stopping right outside. I can see a shadow under the gap. Can hear something that might be breathing. The doorknob is turning. I should have stayed in the forest. Should have let it end there 17 years ago instead of running. Because now it's here, in my apartment in Boulder, 1,000 miles from Cascade Ridge, and I understand finally that distance doesn't matter. Time doesn't matter. You can't run from something that exists outside the rules, something that was there before maps and names and boundaries. The door is opening, and standing in the hallway, tall and narrow and absolutely still, is a shape that I've been seeing in my nightmares for 17 years. It's here. It found me, and I realize, in this last clear moment before whatever happens next, that it was never about the forest at all. It was about me. It's always been about me. The boot prints weren't a trail. They were a countdown, and I finally reached 0. I've been working as a ranger in Blackwood National Forest for almost 9 years, and I thought I knew every square mile of this place. Every fire road, every trail marker, every abandoned lookout tower from the days when they still staffed them year-round. I've got maps in my head that are more detailed than the ones we hand out at the visitor center, routes and shortcuts that aren't in any official documentation. Or at least I thought I did. It was early March when everything I thought I knew got turned sideways. The winter had been brutal that year. Record snowfall, temperatures that stayed below freezing for weeks at a time, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache when you breathe. We'd been dealing with frozen pipes at the ranger stations, downed trees blocking half the access roads, and a backlog of maintenance work that would take us well into spring to clear. The snow was finally starting to melt when my supervisor, a grizzled former Marine named Porter, called me into his office at the main compound. He had a topographic map spread across his desk, the kind we use for backcountry navigation, with elevation lines and watershed markers and all the fire roads penciled in by hand over the years. "Hayes," he said, not looking up from the map. "I need you to do a survey run up in the northwest sector, grid 47J through 47M. He tapped a section of the map with one thick finger. "Winter damage assessment. Check the old logging roads, mark any washouts or blockages, standard stuff." I leaned over the desk, studying the area he'd indicated. It was remote, even by Blackwood standards, a section of old-growth forest that didn't get many visitors even in peak season. The terrain was rough, lots of elevation change, and the few trails that ran through there were rated difficult. Not impossible, just challenging enough that most casual hikers went elsewhere. "No problem," I said. "Want me to check the fire breaks while I'm up there?" "Yeah, good idea. And keep an eye out for any new bear sign. We had reports last fall of a sow with cubs in that area. She might still be denned up, but if she's out early, I want to know about it." I grabbed the coordinates, loaded up my truck with gear, and headed out around 0800. It was a clear morning, the kind where the sky is so blue it almost hurts to look at, and the air had that particular smell of pine and wet earth that only comes with early spring. The drive took about 40 minutes on progressively worse roads, until I was finally bouncing along a rutted track that barely qualified as drivable. I parked at the end of the logging road and continued on foot, carrying my pack with the GPS unit, camera, notebook, and enough supplies for a long day in the backcountry. The plan was simple. Walk a rough circuit through the grid squares Porter had assigned me, document anything that needed attention, and be back to the truck before dark. The first few hours were routine. I marked 3 trees that had come down across the old road, noted some erosion near a seasonal creek, photographed some elk scat that looked relatively fresh. The forest was quiet in that heavy way it gets when snow is still clinging to the north-facing slopes and the ground is soft underfoot. I saw plenty of animal tracks, deer, rabbit, what might have been a bobcat, but no sign of the bear Porter had mentioned. Around noon, I stopped to eat lunch on a flat boulder that gave me a decent view of the valley below. I was checking my position on the GPS, making sure I was staying on course, when I noticed something odd. According to the unit, there was a structure about a quarter mile to the northeast, not marked on my paper map, not in any of the databases I'd reviewed before heading out. Just a small square icon indicating some kind of building. That wasn't entirely unusual. The GPS data gets updated more frequently than our paper maps, and sometimes old cabins or abandoned ranger stations get added to the system even if they're not considered significant enough to mark on the official maps. But something about it bothered me. I'd been working this forest for 9 years, and I'd never heard anyone mention a structure in this area. Curiosity got the better of me. I had time, and it was on my general route anyway. Worst case, it would be a collapsed hunting shack or an old survey shelter, and I documented for the records. I finished my sandwich, packed up my gear, and headed northeast. The terrain got rougher as I went. I was climbing now, pushing through areas where the undergrowth was thick enough that I had to force my way through, branches catching at my jacket and pack. The GPS kept insisting the structure was ahead, distance clicking down. 200 meters, 150, 100. And then I saw it. It was a cabin, set in a small clearing that I would have sworn wasn't there a moment before. The structure was old, but not ancient. Probably built sometime in the 60s or 70s, judging by the construction style. Single story, maybe 400 square feet, with a pitched roof and a small covered porch. The logs were weathered but solid-looking, and there was a stone chimney on the north side. What struck me immediately was how well maintained it looked. No broken windows, no obvious damage to the roof, no vegetation growing up the sides the way you'd expect from a building that had been abandoned for decades. It looked occupied, or at least recently occupied. I approached slowly, that old ranger instinct kicking in, the one that says you don't just barge into places without knowing what you're walking into. I called out, "Hello? Anybody home? Forest Service." No answer, just the wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of water running somewhere. I climbed the 3 steps to the porch, noting that the wood didn't creak or sag under my weight. Solid, well built. On the porch was a small stack of firewood, neatly split and arranged. I touched the top piece, dry, like it had been stored there for a while, but not rotted. Next to the woodpile was a pair of boots, caked with dried mud. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully closed, standing open maybe an inch, like someone had pulled it shut but hadn't checked to make sure it latched. I pushed it open slowly, calling out again. "Forest Service, if anyone's here, make yourself known." Silence. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Not musty or damp, the way abandoned buildings usually smell. It smelled like coffee. Fresh coffee. The scent still hanging in the air like someone had brewed a pot within the last hour or two. The interior was simple. One main room with a wood stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a cot with a sleeping bag folded neatly on top, some shelves with canned goods and supplies. Everything was clean, organized, almost militarily precise. On the table sat a coffee mug, still half full, and next to it a book lying face down like someone had just set it aside. I walked over and touched the side of the mug. Warm. Not hot, but definitely warm, like the coffee had been poured maybe 20 or 30 minutes ago. My skin prickled. I turned slowly, scanning the room, looking for any sign of who might have been here. The sleeping bag looked recently used. I could see the impression where someone had been lying on it. The wood stove was cold, but there were fresh ashes in it, and when I opened the door I could see the remnants of a fire that had burned down to coals and then gone out. On the shelves, I found the usual supplies you'd expect in a backcountry cabin: canned beans, soup, coffee, a few packages of dried goods. But there were also personal items: a razor, a toothbrush in a cup, a small mirror propped against the wall. Someone had been living here, or at least staying here regularly. I pulled out my radio, keyed it. "Base, this is Hayes. You copy?" Static, then Porter's voice. "Copy, Hayes. Go ahead." "I'm at grid reference." I checked my GPS, read off the coordinates. Found an occupied cabin, or recently occupied anyway. "You have any record of a structure at this location?" A pause. "Say again, Hayes? You found a what?" "A cabin. Looks like someone's been using it. There's fresh supplies, warm coffee on the table, but it's not on any of my maps." Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear Porter talking to someone in the background, muffled voices discussing something. Then, "Hayes, we don't have any structures registered at those coordinates. You sure about your position?" I looked at my GPS again. The coordinates were clear, and the little building icon was right on top of my current location. "Affirmative. GPS shows a structure marker right where I'm standing." "Okay, hold position. I'm going to check the archives, see if there's any historical record. Might be an old ranger station we don't have in the current database. Don't touch anything, and if anyone shows up, get their information, but don't confront them. Could be squatters. Copy that." I clipped the radio back to my belt and looked around the cabin again, more carefully this time. That's when I noticed the logbook. It was sitting on one of the shelves, a standard issue Forest Service logbook with a green cover, the kind we use at ranger stations and fire lookouts. I pulled it down, flipped it open. The entries went back years. Dates, names, brief notes about weather conditions, wildlife sightings, maintenance tasks, standard stuff. But as I flipped through the pages, something started to feel wrong. The dates were inconsistent. I'd see an entry from June 2019, then the next entry would be from March 2015, then October 2020, then back to January 2018. I turned more pages, trying to make sense of the chronology. Some entries were in different handwriting, which made sense if different rangers had been using the cabin. But the dates kept jumping around, forward and backward, with no clear pattern. and some of the entries themselves were strange. March 15, 2015. Arrived at Cabin 47 for winter assessment. Found front door open. No sign of forced entry. Coffee on the table still warm. No one present. R. Dalton. October 3, 2020. Standard patrol. Cabin appears unused, dusty, no recent activity. Marked for maintenance review. S. Martinez. June 22, 2019. Emergency shelter during storm. Cabin in excellent condition. Wood stove functional. Someone has been maintaining this place, but no one here now. Will report to base. K. Porter. I stopped at that last entry. Porter. My supervisor Porter? I flipped back through the pages looking for more entries with that name. Found 3 more spanning from 2016 to 2019, all noting that the cabin was empty but well maintained, all saying he'd report it to base. But he'd just told me over the radio that there was no record of this cabin, so either he'd forgotten about it, which seemed unlikely given how specific his entries were, or something else was going on. I kept reading, going further back in the logbook. The entries got sparser, the handwriting older and harder to read. I found entries from the 1990s, the 1980s, even a few from what looked like the 1970s. All following the same pattern. Rangers arriving to find the cabin empty but recently used, noting warm coffee or fresh ashes in the stove or boot prints on the porch. The last entry in the book was dated 2 weeks ago. February 18th. The handwriting was shaky, rushed. Something's wrong with this place. The door won't stay closed. I keep closing it and it opens again. The coffee pot keeps brewing even though I didn't turn it on. I'm leaving. Don't come back here. Name illegible. I felt the temperature in the cabin drop. Or maybe it was just my imagination. I looked at the coffee mug on the table, at the half-full cup of dark liquid. Then I looked at the coffee pot sitting on a small camp stove near the wood stove. The camp stove wasn't on. The burner wasn't even warm. But the coffee pot was full, and I could see steam rising from the spout. I backed away from the table, my hand instinctively going to the radio. But before I could key it, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. The creak of old wood under weight. Then the sound stopped, right outside the door. I stood there, not breathing, watching the door. It was still open the same inch it had been when I arrived. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door began to swing inward, opening wider. There was no one there. Just the empty porch, the stack of firewood, the muddy boots. But the door kept opening, smoothly and deliberately, until it was standing wide open. "Hello?" My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Who's there?" The wind picked up, pushing through the open door, bringing with it the smell of pine and earth and something else, something I couldn't identify. Old smoke, maybe, or old paper. The smell of things that had been closed up too long. I moved toward the door slowly, keeping my eyes on the porch and the clearing beyond. Nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone. Just the forest, quiet and still. I stepped out onto the porch and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, leading away from the cabin. Fresh prints. The mud still wet and dark. They were the same size and tread pattern as the boots sitting on the porch. But there was something wrong with them. They didn't lead anywhere. After about 10 feet, they just stopped, right in the middle of the clearing. No sign of where they'd come from, no continuation in any direction. Just those few prints, ending abruptly as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. My radio crackled. Porter's voice. "Hayes, I found something. There's a reference in the 1973 archives to a cabin 47 in that sector, emergency shelter built in the 60s for fire crews. But according to this, it burned down in 74. Total loss, nothing salvageable. I looked at the cabin behind me. Solid, intact, no sign of fire damage. "Porter," I said slowly, "I'm looking at it right now. It's definitely not burned down." "That's impossible, Hayes. The report says it was completely destroyed. We're talking foundation only, total structural loss." "Then someone rebuilt it. No construction permits on file. No maintenance records after 74. Hayes, officially that cabin doesn't exist." I turned back to the clearing, to those impossible footprints. Then, what am I standing in? No answer. The radio hissed static, and under the static I thought I heard something else. A voice, maybe, or just interference. It sounded like someone trying to speak through water. "Porter? You're breaking up. Say again?" More static, then faint and distorted. "Get out. Not safe. Hayes, get—" The transmission cut off completely. I tried to raise him again, got nothing but dead air. I checked the radio, fully charged, working fine, but I couldn't get through to base. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that clearing, away from that cabin that shouldn't exist, away from those footprints that led nowhere. But I'm a ranger. It's my job to investigate, to document, to understand. So instead, I went back inside. The coffee mug on the table was empty now. Bone dry, like it had been sitting there for years. The book I'd seen lying face down was gone. I searched the table, the shelves, even checked under the cot. Nothing. And the logbook I'd been reading was back on the shelf, but when I pulled it down and opened it, the pages were blank. Every single page, empty. I grabbed my camera, started taking pictures. The cabin interior, the coffee pot, the empty logbook, everything. I had to document this, had to have some kind of proof that I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I noticed the dates carved into the wall near the door. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scratched into the wood with a knife or nail. Dates going back decades: 1967, 1972, 1983, 95, 2001, 2008, 2040, 2019. And next to each date, initials. Some I recognized from the logbook entries. Some I didn't. The most recent carving was from 2 weeks ago. February 18th. The same date as that last frantic logbook entry. The initials were CM. I pulled out my phone, thinking I'd try to call base directly, maybe get better reception than the radio. No signal, but when I opened my camera roll to check the photos I'd just taken, they were all corrupted. Black screens, digital artifacts, fragments of images that didn't match what I remembered photographing. The light in the cabin changed. It took me a moment to realize what was different. The angle of the sunlight coming through the windows was wrong. It had been early afternoon when I'd entered, sunlight coming from the south. Now it was coming from the west, the long shadows of late day. I checked my watch, 2:45 p.m. That couldn't be right. I'd only been in the cabin for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour at most. But my watch insisted it was almost 3 in the afternoon, and the sun agreed. I grabbed my pack, suddenly desperate to get out. But when I turned toward the door, it was closed. I distinctly remembered leaving it open, but now it was shut tight, the latch engaged. I yanked it open and stepped out onto the porch, and froze. The clearing was different. The trees were in different positions. The fallen log I'd noted on my way in was gone, and the small creek I'd heard in the distance was now much closer, running right along the edge of the clearing. And standing in the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, was a figure. It was a man, or it looked like a man, dressed in an old ranger uniform. The kind we wore in the 70s, before they updated the design. He was standing with his back to me, absolutely still, facing the tree line. "Hey, Hakaisu," I called out. "Hey, you okay?" The figure didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me in any way. Just stood there, rigid and still. I stepped down from the porch, moving slowly. "I'm a ranger, Forest Service, can you hear me?" Still nothing. I got closer, close enough to see details. The uniform was old, faded, but intact. On the back of his jacket, I could make out a name patch. Morrison. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and my hand went right through him. Not through like he was a ghost in the movies, all translucent and shimmering. He looked solid, real, substantial. But when I tried to make contact, there was nothing there. Just air, cold air, and the smell of old smoke. I stumbled backward, and that's when the figure started to turn. Slowly, mechanically, rotating to face me. I didn't want to see his face. Everything in me was screaming not to look, to run, to get away before I saw what I was about to see. But I couldn't move. I was frozen there, watching, as the figure completed its turn and faced me. There was no face, just a blank space where a face should be, smooth and featureless, like unfinished clay. But somehow, I knew it was looking at me, watching me, seeing me even without eyes. The radio on my belt crackled to life. Porter's voice, clear as day. "Hayes, report. What's your status?" I grabbed for it, not taking my eyes off the faceless figure. "Porter, there's something... Hayes, you need to get out of there, now. We found more records. Cabin 47 isn't just burned down. 7 Rangers have gone missing in that sector over the last 50 years. 3 of them were last seen investigating reports of an abandoned cabin. Hayes, that place is a dead zone. Get out now." The figure took a step toward me. I ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, not caring about the noise, not caring about the branches tearing at my jacket and face, just running. My pack caught on something and I shrugged out of it without stopping, letting it fall. I could hear my camera breaking, my GPS unit cracking, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I don't know how long I ran. Time felt elastic again, unreliable. It could have been minutes or hours. But eventually, I stumbled out onto the logging road where I'd left my truck. It was exactly where I'd parked it, unchanged, normal. I collapsed against the driver's side door, gasping, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out of my pocket. I managed to unlock the truck, threw myself inside, locked all the doors. For a long time, I just sat there, breathing, trying to convince myself I was okay. I was out. I was safe. Whatever that place was, I was away from it now. My radio crackled. "Porter. Hayes, do you copy? Hayes, report." I grabbed the radio with trembling hands. "I'm here. I'm at my truck. I'm okay." "Thank God. Listen to me carefully. Do not go back to that location. Do you understand? Under no circumstances are you to return to that sector." "Understood." "And Hayes, did you see anything in the cabin?" I hesitated. How do I explain what I saw? A figure with no face, footprints that led nowhere, a building that burned down 50 years ago but still stood solid and real. "Yeah," I said finally. "I saw something." Silence on the other end, then, "Come back to base. We'll debrief when you get here." I started the truck, turned it around, and drove away from that place as fast as the rutted road would allow. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if anything was following me. When I got back to base, Porter was waiting. He had files spread across his desk, old records pulled from archives, some of them so old the paper was yellowing and brittle. He didn't ask me to sit down, just started talking. "Morrison," he said, tapping one of the files. "James Morrison, ranger here from 1971 to 1974. Last seen in March of '74, investigating reports of an abandoned cabin in Sector 47J. Never found. Declared dead in absentia after 7 years. He pulled out another file. Catherine Mills, 19A9. Same sector, same story. Went to check on a structure that showed up on GPS, but not on official maps. Never came back. He kept going. More names, more dates. 1995, 2003, 2011. All the same pattern. All in the same general area. All last seen investigating a cabin that officially didn't exist. The last one was 2 weeks ago, Porter said quietly. Cooper Matthews. Young guy, eager, wanted to make a difference. Radioed in that he'd found an old cabin, said he was going to document it. That was the last we heard from him. CM, the initials carved into the wall. What is that place? I asked. Porter shook his head. We don't know. Best theory is some kind of geographical anomaly, a pocket where time doesn't work right. Or maybe it's something else, something we don't have a name for. All we know is that people go there and they don't come back. But I came back. Yeah, he said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You did. You're the first one in 50 years. That should have been reassuring. But the way he said it, the way he looked at me, made me think he wasn't sure that was a good thing. They put me on administrative leave for a week, suggested I talk to a counselor, standard protocol for traumatic incidents. I spent most of that week in my apartment, trying to process what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it was real and not some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I knew it was real. I had the scratches on my face from running through the undergrowth. I had the memories, sharp and clear, and I had the feeling, deep in my gut, in my bones, that I'd left something unfinished up there. When I came back to work, they'd reassigned my patrol routes. I was covering the southern sectors now, nowhere near 47J. No one said it explicitly, but the message was clear. Stay away from that area. I tried. For months, I stayed away. Did my job, kept my head down, tried not to think about Cabin 47 or the faceless figure or those impossible footprints. But it was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a question I couldn't stop asking. What happened to the others? Morrison, Mills, Matthews, all the rangers who'd gone to that cabin and never came back. Where did they go? Were they dead, or were they somewhere else? Somewhere outside normal space and time. Trapped in that place the way I'd almost been trapped. I started doing research in my off hours. Talked to old-timers who'd worked the forest back in the 70s and 80s. Collected stories, tried to piece together a picture of what that cabin was and why it existed. Most people didn't want to talk about it. Those who did gave me fragments, pieces of a puzzle that never quite came together. One retired ranger, a guy named Sullivan who'd worked Blackwood in the 80s, told me about a legend the old forest crews used to tell. They said that before the Forest Service, before the park system, before any kind of official management, there were people living in these woods, not Native Americans. This was something else, something older. Hermits, maybe, or outcasts, people who'd chosen to live outside civilization. And sometimes, Sullivan said, the forest remembers them, creates echoes of the places they built, the lives they lived. Cabins that appear and disappear, following rules that don't match the rules of the normal world. You saw one of those echoes, Sullivan told me, his eyes distant, remembering. Most people, they go in and they get absorbed, become part of the echo, part of the loop. You got out because you didn't stay too long, didn't close the door behind you, metaphorically speaking. What about the others? I asked. The ones who disappeared? He shook his head. "They're still there. Not dead, not exactly, just elsewhere. Stuck in the moment they found that cabin, living it over and over, trying to make sense of something that can't be made sense of." I thought about Morrison, about his faceless figure standing in that clearing. Was that him? Caught in some kind of temporal loop, repeating the moment he discovered the cabin forever? Was he still there now, still turning to face visitors who stumbled into that impossible place? 6 months after my encounter, I broke protocol. I went back. I didn't tell Porter, didn't file a route plan, just grabbed some gear and drove out to Sector 47J on my day off. I told myself I needed closure, needed to see if it was still there or if it had been some kind of temporary phenomenon. But really, I think I needed to try to help them. Morrison, Mills, Matthews, all the others. If they were trapped there, stuck in some kind of loop, maybe I could find a way to break them out. The logging road was the same as I remembered. I parked in the same spot, grabbed my pack, and started walking. I had my GPS, had the exact coordinates of where the cabin should be. I pushed through the undergrowth, climbed the rough terrain, followed the route I'd taken before. But when I got to the clearing, it was empty. No cabin, no creek running along the edge. Just trees and undergrowth and the normal sounds of the forest. I checked my GPS 3 times, confirmed I was in the right location. But there was nothing there. I searched the area for over an hour, walking in expanding circles, looking for any sign of the cabin or the clearing. Nothing. It was like it had never existed. As I was about to give up and head back, I found something. A small pile of stones, carefully stacked, in the middle of where the clearing should have been, and on top of the pile, a ranger badge. The metal was tarnished, corroded by years of exposure, but I could just make out the engraving. Morrison, J. Morrison. I picked it up, the metal cold in my palm, and that's when I heard it. A sound like wind moving through empty rooms, like doors opening and closing in the distance, and underneath that, faint and far away, voices, people calling out, asking for help, asking for someone to find them. I dropped the badge like it burned me, and the sounds stopped immediately. The badge lay on the stones, catching the afternoon light, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw something else. A flicker, like bad reception on an old TV, a glimpse of the cabin, the clearing, the faceless figure standing exactly where it had been standing before. Then it was gone, and there was just forest again. I left the badge where it was and walked away. I didn't run this time, but I didn't look back either. And when I got back to my truck, I sat there for a long time before I could make myself start the engine. That was 3 years ago. I still work at Blackwood, still do my patrols, still check in with Porter at the end of each shift. I don't go near Sector 47J anymore. No one does. Porter had it officially closed to the public, marked as hazardous terrain, unstable ground conditions. It's not technically a lie. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the ranger station late at night, doing paperwork or monitoring the radio channels, I'll see something on the GPS display, a building icon, appearing for just a moment in Sector 47J before disappearing again. And every time I see it, I wonder who found it this time. Wonder if they got out, or if they're still there trapped in that impossible space, living the same moment over and over. And I wonder, though I try not to think about this too much, what would have happened if I'd stayed in that cabin, if I'd closed the door behind me when I left, or if I'd taken the coffee mug, or if I'd carved my own initials into that wall next to all the others. Would I be there now, a figure with no face, turning slowly to greet the next visitor? Would I be part of the echo, part of the loop, forever standing in that clearing waiting for someone to find me? I don't know. And I'm terrified that someday I might find out. Because here's the thing they don't tell you about places like Cabin 47. Once you've been there, once you've seen it and touched it and breathed its air, you're connected to it. Part of you stays there even after you leave, and part of it stays with you. I still smell coffee sometimes when I'm alone. Fresh coffee, the scent coming from nowhere, hanging in the air for just a moment before it fades. And sometimes when I'm out on patrol and I come around a bend in the trail, I'll see it out of the corner of my eye. A cabin that shouldn't be there standing in a clearing that doesn't exist. I don't turn to look. I learned that lesson. If you don't look directly at it, if you don't acknowledge it, sometimes it lets you pass. But I know it's there. I can feel it watching me, patient and still, waiting for the moment when my curiosity gets the better of me again. Waiting for the moment when I turn the handle and step inside and close the door behind me. And then I'll be part of the echo too. Last week, a new ranger started at Blackwood. Young guy, fresh out of training, eager to prove himself. His name is Carson. At his orientation, Porter took him aside and gave him the same speech he gives all the new hires. Respect the forest, follow protocol, don't take unnecessary risks, and stay away from Sector 47J. Carson asked why, of course. They always do. And Porter told him the official story. Unstable terrain, potential hazards, area closed to the public and staff except for emergency situations. But I saw the look in Carson's eyes. That curiosity, that need to know what's really out there. I've seen that look before. I've had that look. So yesterday I pulled him aside after the briefing, told him I needed to talk to him about something, off the record. We went to a diner in town, somewhere away from the office, somewhere we couldn't be overheard. I'm going to tell you something, I said, and you're going to think I'm crazy, but I need you to listen, and I need you to take it seriously. I told him everything. The cabin, the footprints, the faceless figure, the rangers who disappeared. I showed him the file I'd put together, the research I'd done, the patterns I'd found. I told him about Morrison's badge, about the sounds I'd heard, about the flicker I'd seen of that impossible place. He listened quietly, not interrupting, and when I was done he sat there for a long moment, processing. "So, what are you saying?" he finally asked. "That there's some kind of supernatural cabin in the forest that traps people?" "I'm saying there's something in Sector 47J that doesn't follow normal rules. Something dangerous. And I'm saying that if you value your life and your sanity, you'll stay away from it." He nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll stay away." But I saw it in his eyes again. That curiosity, that pull. The same thing I felt. The same thing that drew Morrison and Mills and Matthews and all the others to that place. And I know, with a certainty that keeps me awake at night, that someday soon, Carson is going to go to Sector 47J. He'll tell himself he's just checking it out, just satisfying his curiosity, just making sure there's nothing to be worried about. And he'll find the cabin, and maybe he'll get out, the way I did. Maybe he'll be smart and fast and lucky enough to escape before the door closes behind him. Or maybe he'll become another name in the file, another set of initials carved into that wall, another faceless figure standing in that clearing, turning slowly to greet the next visitor. I hope he gets out, I really do, but I don't think he will, because Cabin 47 is patient. It's been there for decades, maybe longer. It knows how to wait. It knows how to draw people in, how to make them curious, how to make them feel like they need to solve the mystery. And once it has them, it doesn't let go. I still see it sometimes in my dreams. The cabin, the clearing, the faceless figure. But in the dreams, I'm the one standing there. I'm the one with no face, turning to greet visitors, trying to warn them but unable to speak. And when I wake up, gasping in the dark of my bedroom, I can smell it. fresh coffee, the scent hanging in the air. And I know that part of me is still there. Part of me never left. And someday, the pull will be too strong. Someday, I'll go back, and I'll walk into that cabin, and I'll close the door behind me. And I'll finally understand what happened to all the others. But until that day comes, I'll keep doing my job. I'll keep patrolling the forest, checking the trails, helping visitors. And I'll keep watching Sector 47J on the GPS display, watching for that building icon to appear. Because someone needs to keep track. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember. Even if, in the end, it won't make any difference. Even if we all end up in that cabin eventually, one way or another. Even if the door is already closing, and we just don't know it yet. I've been working as a ranger at Redwood Heights National Park for 12 years, and if there's one thing I've learned in that time, it's that numbers don't lie. Trail counters, visitor logs, permit records, these are the bedrock of park management. The objective data we use to make decisions about everything from resource allocation to wildlife protection. Numbers are reliable. Numbers make sense. At least, that's what I used to think. My name is Archer Kane, and I'm the senior ranger for the Northern District of Redwood Heights, which covers about 40 square miles of old-growth forest, 3 major trail systems, and a network of fire roads that date back to the lumber company days before this land became federal property. It's beautiful country, the kind of place that reminds you why parks like this matter. Ancient trees, some of them 800 years old, towering so high you have to crane your neck back until it hurts just to see their tops. Fern-choked ravines where the light turns green and liquid. Elk grazing in meadows at dawn, their breath steaming in the cold air. It's also my responsibility. Every trail, every campsite, every square foot of it. Which is why I take things like equipment malfunction seriously. The trouble started in late September, right at the tail end of the busy season. We'd had a good summer, record visitor numbers actually, which meant more permits issued, more campsite reservations, more wear and tear on the trails. Nothing we couldn't handle, but it kept us busy. By September, we were all looking forward to the shoulder season, when the crowds would thin out and we could catch our breath. We have automated trail counters at most of our major trailheads. They're simple devices, basically pressure sensors embedded in the trail surface that record each time someone passes over them. The data gets transmitted wirelessly to our monitoring system where we can track visitor patterns, identify heavily used areas that might need maintenance, that kind of thing. They're not perfect. Sometimes they miscount if people are walking in a tight group, and they can't distinguish between a person and a large animal, but they're reliable enough for our purposes. The counter at Ravens Peak Trail had been installed 3 years ago, and it had always performed consistently. Ravens Peak is one of our most popular trails, a moderate 5-mile loop with some decent elevation gain and a spectacular view at the top. During peak season, we'd see maybe 60 to 80 people a day on that trail. By late September, the numbers had dropped to 20 or 30. But on September 28th, the counter recorded 87 people entering the trail after sunset. I noticed it during my morning routine, checking the overnight data while I drank my coffee at the ranger station. At first, I thought it was a system error, a glitch in the software. But when I pulled up the detailed logs, the data was clear. Starting at 8:47 p.m. and continuing until 3:14 a.m., the counter had registered 87 separate activations. That didn't make sense. The park closes at sunset, which in late September is around 7:30 p.m. The gates are locked, the parking lots are closed, and we do a final patrol to make sure no one's still on the trails. We'd done that patrol the night before. I'd done it myself, actually, and the Ravens Peak parking lot had been empty at 7:45 p.m. So, How did 87 people get onto that trail after dark? I called our IT contractor, a guy named Patel, who maintains all our digital systems. Told him what I was seeing, asked if there could be a software bug or a corrupted data feed. Unlikely, he said. Those counters are pretty simple devices. They're hard to screw up. But I can run a diagnostic remotely if you want. Do it. He called me back an hour later. Counter's working fine, Kane. No errors, no anomalies in the hardware or transmission. If it's recording activations, something's activating it. Could it be animals? Maybe a herd of elk crossing the trail? Maybe. But 87 activations over 6 hours? That's a lot of elk. And they'd have to be walking single file for the counter to register them separately. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the data on my screen. 87 activations. Between 8:47 p.m. and 3:14 a.m. All of them after the park was closed, after the parking lot was empty, after I'd personally verified that no one was on the trail. I decided to check it in person, grabbed my gear, and drove out to the Ravens Peak trailhead. It was mid-morning by then, sunny and clear, the kind of day that makes you forget anything weird ever happens in the world. The parking lot was about half full, maybe a dozen vehicles, early hikers getting a jump on the day. I walked the trail, checking for any signs of nighttime activity. No fresh tracks that looked unusual, no evidence of camping or fire building, no trash or disturbed vegetation. The trail was in good condition, well maintained, exactly as it should be. The counter itself was embedded in the trail about 20 yards from the trailhead, a small, rectangular sensor flush with the ground. You wouldn't even notice it if you didn't know it was there. I knelt down, inspected it visually. No damage, no obvious signs of tampering. It looked completely normal. I stood there for a moment, watching hikers pass over it. Each time someone crossed the sensor, I imagined the data point being recorded. Time, date, activation number. Clean, simple, objective. But if the counter was working correctly, if the data was accurate, then something had crossed this sensor 87 times between 8:47 p.m. and 3:14 a.m. last night. Something that left no tracks. Something that was in the park after it closed. Something that walked this trail in the dark. I filed a report when I got back to the station, noted the anomaly, recommended increased patrols in the area. Then I put it out of my mind. Weird things happen sometimes. You document them and move on. But the next night it happened again. This time, 92 activations. Same time window, starting just before 9 p.m., ending at 3:14 a.m. exactly. I checked the patrol logs. Rangers had swept the area at sunset, confirmed the parking lot was empty. But between 9 p.m. and 3:14 a.m., 92 people, or things that registered the same as people, had walked over that counter. I called Patel again. The counter's definitely malfunctioning. It has to be. I'm telling you, Kane. The hardware is fine. I can replace it if you want, but I don't think that's the problem. Then what is? He was quiet for a moment. You want my honest opinion? Something's actually using that trail at night. I don't know what, and I don't know why the activations stop at exactly 3:14 every time, but the data doesn't lie. Numbers don't lie, I said. Exactly. I decided to stake it out. If something was actually using that trail after dark, I wanted to see what it was. I cleared it with my supervisor, arranged to do an overnight observation, packed my gear for a long night in the woods. I set up in the parking lot around 7 p.m. after the last hikers had left. Brought a thermos of coffee, some snacks, a camera with night vision capability, and my service radio. The plan was simple. Sit in my truck, watch the trailhead, document anything that moved. The sun set around 7:30, and the forest settled into that particular quietness of twilight, when the day animals have bedded down and the night animals haven't quite started moving yet. I sat in the cab of my truck, windows down so I could hear, eyes on the trailhead. Nothing happened for the first hour. Just darkness deepening, stars coming out, the temperature dropping. Normal. At 8:47 p.m., the exact time the activations had started the previous 2 nights, I felt it. It wasn't a sound or a movement or anything I could point to and say, "There, that's what changed." It was a feeling, a shift in the air, like the pressure had dropped or the quality of the silence had altered. The forest was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Expectant, waiting. I grabbed my camera, scanned the trailhead through the night vision scope. Nothing. Just the empty trail, the information kiosk, the dark shapes of trees. Then my radio crackled. Not a voice, just static, but loud enough to make me jump. I checked the unit. It was off. I turned it off before I settled in, not wanting any noise to disturb the observation. But it was crackling anyway, green power light glowing faintly in the dark. I turned the volume down, and that's when I saw the first one. A figure walking out of the forest onto the trail. It moved smoothly, purposefully, and at first I thought it was just a late hiker who'd ignored the closure. But as I watched through the scope, trying to get a clear view, something felt wrong about the way it moved. Too smooth, too steady, like it was gliding more than walking. I raised the camera, tried to take a picture, but the autofocus wouldn't lock. The figure was there. I could see it clearly through the scope, but the camera couldn't seem to find it. The lens hunting back and forth, unable to focus. The figure crossed the parking lot, heading for the trailhead. I lost sight of it for a moment behind the information kiosk, and when it emerged on the other side, there were 2 of them. Then 3. Then 5. They were appearing out of nowhere, manifesting from the shadows between the trees, all moving toward the trail in that same smooth, gliding way. None of them were dressed like hikers. Some wore what looked like old-fashioned clothes, long coats, wide-brimmed hats. Others were in more modern clothing, but nothing was quite right. The colors were off, the cuts were wrong, like they were wearing clothes from memory rather than reality. I tried the camera again, same result. No focus, no image capture. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe a different device would work better. But when I opened the camera app, the screen just showed static. Black and white snow, like an old TV with no signal. The figures kept coming. 10, 15, 20. All heading for the trailhead, all crossing the spot where the counter was embedded in the trail. And each time one of them passed over it, I heard a faint click through my radio, even though it was still turned off. Click, click, click. Each one counting. I should have been terrified. Maybe I was, somewhere underneath. But mostly I felt detached, like I was watching something happen on a screen rather than right in front of me. My ranger brain was still working, still trying to process and categorize unexplained phenomenon, possible mass hallucination. Recommend psychological evaluation. By 9:15 p.m., there were maybe 40 or 50 of them on the trail, all walking in the same direction, up toward Raven's Peak. They didn't interact with each other, didn't speak or acknowledge each other's presence. Just walked. That smooth gliding walk, disappearing into the darkness of the trail. I waited until they were all gone, until the parking lot was empty again and the forest had returned to its previous quiet. Then I got out of my truck. I know that was stupid. Every horror movie, every true crime documentary, every safety briefing I'd ever attended, they all say the same thing. When weird shit starts happening, you stay put, you call for backup, you don't investigate alone. But I was a ranger. This was my park, my responsibility. I needed to know what was happening. I walked to the trailhead, flashlight in hand, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to see what the beam might reveal. The trail looked normal. No footprints in the dust, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had passed this way. I knelt down at the counter, put my hand on it. The metal was cold, normal. I stood up, shone my light down the trail into the darkness, and I heard them. Footsteps, dozens of them moving through the forest. Not on the trail, through the forest all around me, like I was surrounded by a crowd of people walking through the trees. But I couldn't see anyone, just darkness, and the columnar shapes of redwoods and my flashlight beam cutting through the black. The footsteps got closer. I could hear them clearly now. The sound of feet on fallen needles, the rustle of movement through undergrowth, closing in from all sides. I backed toward my truck, keeping my light moving, sweeping it in arcs to try to catch sight of whatever was making those sounds. Nothing. Just trees and darkness, and that sound of approaching footsteps. I made it to my truck, got inside, locked the doors. The footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again. That heavy, expectant silence. I sat there, breathing hard, my hands shaking, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. My radio crackled again. This time, there was a voice underneath the static, faint and distorted. Counter never stops. They keep walking. Who is this? I grabbed the radio, keyed it even though it was still supposedly off. Identify yourself. More static. Then, can't stop. Count them all. Every night. 3:14. The transmission cut off. I tried to respond, got nothing. The radio went dark, the power light fading out even though I hadn't touched any controls. I started the truck and got out of there, drove back to the ranger station, tried to write up a report, couldn't find the words to describe what I'd seen. How do you document something that doesn't make sense? How do you saw approximately 40 to 50 figures of unknown origin walking on closed trail, unable to photograph or verify, heard disembodied footsteps and mysterious radio transmission into an official incident report? I settled for observed unusual activity at Ravens Peak Trailhead, recommend further investigation. Then I went home and didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the counter data. 96 activations between 8:47 p.m. and 3:14 a.m. I'd counted maybe 40 or 50 figures. Where did the other activations come from? I pulled up the historical data for the Ravens Peak counter, going back to when it was installed 3 years ago. For the most part, it showed normal patterns. Higher numbers in summer, lower in winter, peaks on weekends and holidays. But scattered throughout, maybe once every few weeks, there were nights like the ones I'd just experienced. Nights when the counter recorded dozens of activations during hours when the park was closed. I'd never noticed before because I'd never looked. Why would I? You trust your equipment, you trust your data, and you don't go looking for anomalies unless something makes you suspicious. But now that I was looking, I could see the pattern. It had been happening for 3 years, ever since the counter was installed. Every 18 to 23 days, the counter would record a surge of nighttime activity, always starting around 8:47 p.m., always ending at exactly 3:14 a.m. I pulled up the maintenance logs, looking for any correlation. Maybe the counter malfunctioned on a regular cycle. Maybe there was an environmental factor that triggered false readings. But there was nothing. No pattern to the dates, no weather correlation, no mechanical explanation. Then I had another thought. I pulled up the visitor logs from before the counter was installed, back when we tracked trail usage manually with paper sign-in sheets at the trailhead. Hikers were supposed to record their names and estimated return times. though compliance was spotty at best. I started going through the old sheets, looking for anything unusual. Most of it was standard stuff, names, dates, times, but every so often I'd find entries that didn't make sense. Names recorded at times when the park should have been closed. Signatures that looked rushed or shaky, like they'd been written in poor light or by someone in a hurry, and occasionally entries that were just wrong. Names that repeated across multiple nights. Signatures that looked identical even when they were supposedly written weeks apart. Time stamps that couldn't possibly be accurate. One entry from August 2015 simply read, "Don't count us. We're already here." I called Patel again, asked him about the technical specifications of the counter. How does it actually work? What makes it activate? Pressure and heat signature, he said. There's a weight sensor and an infrared detector. Both have to trigger simultaneously for it to record an activation. That's how it distinguishes between people and animals. Animals usually don't have the right combination of weight and thermal output. So, for it to activate, something has to be warm-blooded and roughly human weight. More or less, yeah. And there's no way to fake that. No environmental condition that could trigger false readings. Not that I know of. I mean, theoretically, you could maybe trick it with some kind of elaborate setup, but why would anyone bother? And how would they do it night after night, always in the same time window, without being detected? I didn't have an answer for that. I decided to review the camera footage. We have a single security camera at the Ravens Peak parking lot, mainly to deter vandalism and car break-ins. It's motion-activated, records to a hard drive that gets reviewed periodically. I'd checked it after the first weird night but hadn't seen anything unusual. Now I wanted to look more carefully. I pulled up the footage from the night I'd done the observation, the night I'd seen the figures. The timestamp showed 8:47 p.m., the moment when the activations had started. The parking lot was empty, just my truck sitting there in the dark. No figures, no movement, nothing. The camera ran for 6 hours, until 3:14 a.m., and the only thing visible was my truck and occasionally me sitting in the cab. But the counter had recorded 96 activations. I'd seen them with my own eyes, watched them walk across the parking lot and onto the trail, but the camera had recorded nothing. I went back through the historical footage, checking other nights when the counter showed anomalous activity. Same thing. Empty parking lots, no visible movement, but the counter kept counting. That's when I started to understand whatever was triggering that counter existed in a space the cameras couldn't see. Or maybe it existed in multiple spaces simultaneously, visible to human eyes but not to electronic sensors. Or maybe, and this was the thought that made my skin crawl, maybe it existed in time differently than we did, moving through moments that the cameras skipped over. I needed to talk to someone who'd worked here longer than I had, someone who might remember if anything unusual had ever been reported in this area. The longest-serving ranger was a woman named Garrett, who'd been at Redwood Heights for almost 30 years before retiring 5 years ago. I tracked down her number, gave her a call. "Kane," she said when she answered, her voice warm with recognition. "Haven't heard from you in a while. What's going on?" I told her about the counter, the nighttime activations, the figures I'd seen. I expected skepticism, maybe concern about my mental state, but she went quiet for a long moment. "The trail counter," she said finally. "That's at Ravens Peak?" "Yeah." "How long has this been happening?" "Since it was installed, 3 years looks like. But I only noticed it recently." Another pause, then, "Kane, before we put in that counter, how much did you know about the history of that trail?" "It's an old logging road, right? Converted to recreational use in the 80s? "Older than that. The logging road follows a route that's been there a lot longer. native trail originally. The Yurok people used it to access the high country for centuries. And before the Park Service took over, before the lumber companies, it was a route that, well, that had a reputation. What kind of reputation? The kind where people said you shouldn't use it at night, where there were stories about travelers who went missing, or who came back changed somehow. The kind of place where the boundary between the living and the dead was supposed to be thin. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You're saying the trail is haunted. I'm saying that when we converted it to recreational use, there were some tribal representatives who advised against it. They said the trail was a pathway, and that making it easier to access might activate it somehow. We didn't listen. We thought it was superstition. Activated how? They said it was a route the dead used to travel between worlds, and that if you made the path too easy, if you encouraged too many living people to use it, the dead might start using it too. Might start walking it again, the way they did in the old days. That's insane? Yeah, I thought so too. But after we opened the trail, we started getting reports. Hikers seeing people on the trail at dusk who weren't there a moment later. Sounds of footsteps when no one was around. Feelings of being followed. Nothing conclusive, nothing we could point to and say this is definitely paranormal. Just a lot of weird reports, more than usual. Did you ever see anything yourself? Once, I was doing a late patrol, checking to make sure the trail was clear before we locked the gates. Saw someone walking up ahead, called out to let them know the park was closing. They didn't respond, just kept walking. I followed them for maybe 5 minutes trying to catch up, but they stayed ahead of me. Then they just weren't there anymore. I reached a straight section of trail where I should have been able to see them for at least 50 yards, but they were gone. What did you do? Finished my patrol. Filed a report about a possible hiker still on the trail after closing, and then tried not to think about it too much. She paused. Kane, if you're seeing things at Raven's Peak, my advice is to do the same. File your reports, do your job, but don't try to understand it. Don't try to count them or track them or figure out where they're going. Some things are better left alone. But I couldn't leave it alone. That's not who I am. I'm a ranger. I solve problems. I investigate discrepancies. I make sure people are safe. And if there was something happening on that trail, something that involved whatever those figures were, I needed to understand it. I started tracking the pattern more carefully, logging every detail I could. The counter always activated at 8:47 p.m. The activations always ended at 3:14 a.m. The number varied, sometimes 70, sometimes over 100, but it always followed the same time window. I tried to find some meaning in the specific times. 8:47 p.m. was roughly when astronomical twilight ended in late September, when the last light faded from the sky. 3:14 a.m. was, I didn't know, no particular astronomical significance. No historical event I could find. Just 3:14, night after night, with mechanical precision. I went back to the trail, this time in daylight, and walked the entire 5-mile loop, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Graves, maybe, or historical markers. Something that would indicate this trail had significance beyond its use as a recreational path. About 3 miles in, at the highest point where the trail crested the ridge and opened onto a spectacular view of the valley below, I found it. A small stone marker, old and weathered, half hidden in the undergrowth. It wasn't an official Park Service marker. The stone was rough cut. The symbols carved into it worn almost smooth by time and weather. I couldn't read the symbols. They looked like they might have been tribal markings, but I wasn't an expert. I took photos, sent them to a contact I had at the state archaeologist's office. She called me back 2 days later. Where did you find this? Raven's Peak Trail, about 3 miles in. What is it? It's a boundary marker. Yurok, probably 19th century or earlier. These symbols indicate a threshold, a place where one world ends and another begins. They were used to mark places that were considered spiritually significant or dangerous. Dangerous how? Places where the dead might cross, places where you weren't supposed to linger after dark. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the photos on my phone. A threshold, a crossing place, right at the highest point of the trail, right where hikers would stop to rest and enjoy the view. Right where dozens of figures walked every 18 to 23 days, between 8:47 p.m. and 3:14 a.m. I should have reported all of this to my supervisor, should have documented everything, requested a formal investigation, maybe even suggested we close the trail pending review. But I knew how that would go. They'd want proof, documentation, objective evidence. And all I had were sensor readings that could be explained as equipment malfunction, historical superstition that could be dismissed as folklore, and my own observations that could be attributed to fatigue or stress or autosuggestion. Numbers don't lie, but they don't tell the whole truth either. So I kept investigating on my own. Started spending more nights at that trailhead, watching, counting, trying to understand the pattern. I couldn't see the figures anymore, or maybe I'd trained myself not to see them, some protective mechanism in my brain that refused to acknowledge something that violated every rule of how reality was supposed to work. But I could feel them. That shift in the air at 8:47, that weight of presence, the sense of movement all around me. And the counter kept counting. 67, 92, 103 every 18 to 23 days, like clockwork. I started having dreams about the trail, walking it in darkness, surrounded by silent figures who glided past me without acknowledgement. In the dreams, I could see their faces, pale, blurred, like photographs left too long in sunlight. And they were looking for something, searching for something they'd lost. I'd wake up with the certainty that I needed to walk that trail at night, needed to follow those figures to wherever they were going. But I resisted. Garrett's warning echoed in my head. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to count them. Some things are better left alone. But the counter kept counting, and I couldn't stop checking the data. It became an obsession, a compulsion. Every morning, I'd pull up the logs, see if there had been another activation event. And every 18 to 23 days, there it was. Dozens of activations, starting at 8:47, ending at 3:14. Other rangers started noticing my fixation. My supervisor called me in, asked if everything was okay, suggested I might want to take some personal time. I told him I was fine, just dealing with some equipment irregularities that I wanted to get to the bottom of. He didn't look convinced, but he let it go. Then, in early November, something changed. The counter recorded an activation event, same pattern as before, but this time the numbers were different. Instead of 60 or 90 activations, there were 317. 317 people, or things that registered as people, walking that trail between 8:47 p.m. and 3:14 a.m. I pulled up the camera footage, even though I knew it wouldn't show anything. And it didn't. Empty parking lot, nothing moving. But the counter had recorded 317 activations. I drove out there the next morning, walked the trail again, looking for some explanation. The forest felt different, heavier somehow, like the air was thicker. And when I reached the boundary marker at the ridge, I found something that hadn't been there before. Fresh flowers. Someone had left a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone, tied with a ribbon. I knelt down, picked up the bouquet. The flowers were fresh, gathered recently, and tucked into the ribbon was a small piece of paper, folded over several times. I unfolded it carefully. The writing was in pencil, faded but legible. For those who walk at night, for those who can't stop walking. Count them if you must, but don't follow them. The trail only goes one direction. There was no signature, no date, just that message, left by someone who knew about the figures, who understood what was happening on this trail. I pocketed the note and kept walking. The trail felt longer than usual. The distance between markers stretched somehow, and all around me, I felt that presence, stronger than before. The sense of movement just out of sight, of footsteps that weren't quite footsteps, of figures that existed in the spaces between moments. When I reached the 3-mile marker, I heard it, a voice, faint and distant, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Not on the trail, but near it. It sounded like someone calling out, asking for help. Every instinct I had as a ranger screamed at me to investigate. Someone might be hurt, might be lost. But I remembered the note. Don't follow them. I stood there listening as the voice called again. It sounded closer now, more urgent. And underneath it, I heard other voices, dozens of them, all calling out in that same tone of desperate need. I turned around and walked back to the parking lot. Didn't run, didn't rush, just walked steadily, keeping my eyes on the trail ahead. The voices followed me for a while, always staying just behind, just out of sight, but I didn't turn around. I didn't look. When I got back to my truck, I sat there for a long time, trying to settle my nerves. The counter had recorded 317 activations the night before. 317 voices calling out in the darkness. 317 people, or things that had once been people, walking a trail that led somewhere I couldn't see and didn't want to understand. I submitted my resignation the next day. Told my supervisor I was taking a position in another park, needed a change of scenery. He didn't try to talk me out of it. Maybe he saw something in my face that told him I'd already made up my mind. I stayed on for 2 more weeks, finished out my notice, trained my replacement. A young ranger named Mason, fresh and eager, ready to prove himself. On his first day, I showed him the monitoring system, the trail maps, the patrol routes, and when we got to the Raven's Peak counter, I hesitated. "This counter," I said finally, "it's been having some irregularities. False readings at night, probably some kind of sensor drift. Don't worry about it too much, just log it and move on." He nodded, making notes. "Should I report it to maintenance?" "Already have. They're aware. Just don't waste too much time trying to figure it out. Some equipment issues fix themselves eventually." That was a lie, of course. The counter hadn't fixed itself in 3 years. It wasn't going to fix itself now. But I couldn't tell him the truth. Couldn't explain about the figures, the voices, the trail that went somewhere the living weren't meant to follow. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. I wouldn't have believed me. So I lied. I told him it was just equipment malfunction, just data irregularities, just numbers that didn't add up quite right. And I told myself that was enough, that he'd figure it out on his own if he needed to, that it wasn't my responsibility anymore. But I still check the data sometimes. Even now, 6 months later, working at a different park in a different state. I still log into the Redwood Heights system remotely, pull up the Raven's Peak counter, look at the numbers. And every 18 to 23 days, like clockwork, I see it. Dozens of activations, sometimes over 100, all recorded between 8:47 p.m. and 3:14 a.m. The counter never stops. The figures keep walking. And somewhere in the darkness of that ancient trail, something continues its endless journey, crossing and recrossing that threshold between worlds, counted but never understood. Mason hasn't reported it yet. Or if he has, it hasn't made its way to any official channels that I have access to. Maybe he's ignoring it, the way I tried to at first. Or maybe he's investigating, the way I did, trying to understand something that can't be understood. I hope he has better sense than I did. I hope he reads the numbers, files his reports, and doesn't think about it too much. I hope he never goes to that trailhead at night, never sees what I saw, never hears those voices calling from the darkness. But I don't think he will, because the trail calls to you. The numbers call to you. The need to understand, to make sense of it, to count them all. It's irresistible. It's what makes us good rangers, that need to know, to document, to understand our territory. And that's exactly what makes us vulnerable to places like Raven's Peak. Last week, I got an email from the Redwood Heights system. Automated alert, triggered by the monitoring software. The Raven's Peak counter had recorded an unusual spike in activity. 473 activations between 8:47 p.m. and 3:14 a.m. 473. The numbers keep going up. Whatever's happening on that trail, it's not diminishing. It's growing. I should call Mason, warn him, tell him what I know, even if he thinks I'm crazy. But what would I say? That the trail is haunted? That the dead walk there every few weeks, crossing some ancient boundary that we don't understand? That the counter is recording something real, even if we can't explain what that something is? He'd think I had a breakdown. Maybe I did. But the numbers don't lie. 473 activations. 473 people. Or things that were once people walking that trail in darkness. And somewhere in all those numbers, in all that data, is a truth I'm not sure I want to face. That the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we think. That there are places where that boundary can be crossed. Places where the dead still walk, still move through the world we inhabit. And we've built a trail right through one of those places. We've marked it on maps, maintained it, encouraged people to walk it. We've made it easier to cross, easier to find, easier to use. And now the dead are using it too. I wonder sometimes how long it will continue. Will it keep growing, those numbers climbing higher and higher, until there are thousands of activations every night? Or will it reach some kind of saturation point, some maximum capacity, and level off? Or will it change? Will those figures start appearing during the day instead of just at night? Will they become more visible, more solid, more present? Will the boundary disappear entirely? And will we wake up one day to find that the dead are walking among us freely, using our trails, crossing our counters, existing in our world the way they exist in theirs? I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to find out. But the counter keeps counting. Every 18 to 23 days, without fail, starting at 8:47 p.m., ending at 3:14 a.m. Recording dozens, hundreds, soon maybe thousands of activations. And somewhere in the darkness of Raven's Peak Trail, figures continue to walk. Silent, purposeful, following some route that exists outside our understanding of time and space. They've been walking for centuries, probably. Long before we built the counter, long before we made the trail, long before we thought we understood this forest. And they'll keep walking long after we're gone. The counter will keep counting. The trail will keep calling. And the numbers, those objective, reliable, trustworthy numbers, will keep recording a truth that we're not ready to accept. That death isn't an ending. It's just another trail to walk, and some of us never stop walking.